Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you very warmly to our webinar today, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the International Safeguarding Conference, I want to extend to you the gratitude of Professor Father Hans Zollner, Dr. Alessandra Campo, Andrew Azzopardi, and Simon Davis. I also want to include Father Daniel Portillo, who is assisting with the webinars, and particularly for participants from South America who are joining us. So we have delegates today from North and South America, Europe and Africa, so you're all very welcome. We value the commitment of all of you in attending and participating in the working groups, because this is a very important part of what we do. Regarding the working groups, I also want to express my gratitude to the facilitators, all of whom have generously accepted the invitation to assist and then write up the responses for each working group following each webinar. I cannot thank the facilitators enough for their support during these 4 webinars. As the ISC, we were determined that we wanted those who attend to experience very clear outcomes to not only enhance their learning, but further that everyone would have some aspect of safeguarding practice which they could take back home to their own context and culture, and perhaps implement or initiate changes which would bring about, indeed, a more positive culture of safeguarding. This was, we believe, even more necessary in the time of a pandemic. I'm now going to read you a statement of information for everyone attending the webinars. During an event like this one, where people attend a webinar to explore different aspects of safeguarding, it is not uncommon to experience a range of emotions and potentially disturbing thoughts or memories. These experiences can stem from the experience of trauma and its impact, and can affect anyone, particularly people who have experienced abuse directly. We would ask that you take good self-care during this webinar today. Some of the presentations are being recorded live, which is the case at this moment. The use of the chat feature is for questions for the keynote speakers, and it is possible that they will appear in the recording. Please therefore avoid using the chat function to exchange personal greetings with other participants. We also wish to advise that it is possible that your image will be included in the recording, or that individual participants might take a screenshot and share on social media with the intention of promoting an important aspect of the webinar content. The programme for today is that the keynote will last 30 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you wish to ask a question and you cannot type it into the chat function, please email Alessandra, and her address is alessandra@saferchurch.org with your question. We will then have a 10-minute break, and I would ask that you leave your computer, laptop, whatever on, that you don't actually leave the meeting, because it will then take us longer to readmit you. Just put yourselves, well, we will mute you and perhaps switch your camera off while you grab some very welcome coffee. And then after the 10 minutes break, you will return and go straight into your breakout rooms. When we have finished the questions with today's speaker, I will remind you again about that detail for you. Okay. With regard to the Rome event, this will be online. We've made that decision just yesterday because of the restrictions of the pandemic. We really would like as many as possible of you to join us for this event online, and we hope you will do so. It will be online from Rome from the 30th of June to the 2nd of July. But we do need you to register separately for this event. I now am really delighted to introduce you to Stuart Allardyce, who is the director of Stop It Now here in Scotland. I'm still in Scotland at the moment. Stuart and indeed his staff and his team at Stop It Now have been very supportive always of safeguarding in the Catholic Church in Scotland, and I'm sure that collaboration will continue with whoever my successor is, as and when he or she is appointed. Stuart is going to talk to us about preventing online sexual offending against children. He is also director at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, with his specific responsibilities, as I've said, for Stop It Now in Scotland, but also for research across the UK charity. He has worked as a social worker in the child abuse field for over 20 years. He is an honorary research fellow at Strathclyde University here in Glasgow and vice chair of the National Organisation of the Treatment of Abuse for UK and Ireland, known to us more locally here and in the UK as NOTA. He is co-author of Working with Children and Young People Who Have Displayed Harmful Sexual Behaviours. Stuart, I really would like to welcome you this evening and this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina, and it's an absolute delight to be with all of you today. It's actually a real honour to be amongst a group with such enormous safeguarding experience, and also, you know, the amazing diversity of kind of cultures and backgrounds that everyone brings, that I'm sure will lead to a lot of rich conversations today. As Tina has said, I'm the one of the directors of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, which is a UK-based child protection charity, which focuses on the prevention of child sexual abuse. So every day, I work with people who have committed sexual offences, either contact sexual offences or online sexual offences. And it's online sexual offending against children that I want to talk about today, and some of the things that we're increasingly learning about the prevention of online sexual offending against children, by which I mean the viewing of sexual exploitation material of children, but also online solicitation and grooming of children. So we're meeting a few different things here. Before we get started, I wonder whether could I get my first slide? Is that possible? Let's see whether that happens, whether the magic appears. Wonderful, I think we've got it. Let me say a word about language. I think language is really important in this area. I'm not today going to be talking about sex offenders, but I'm going to use the terminology people who have committed sexual offences. The reason for that is to try and avoid the labelling of individuals and to use people first language. One of the things that I find quite striking in my field is that we continue to use this term sex offender, which describes precisely what it is that we don't want people to continue doing. So we construct a label which is about all the worst things that they've ever done in their life, which is continuously reflected back on those individuals. So today I'll be talking about people who have committed sexual offences. And the other phrase that I won't be using today is that I won't be talking about child pornography. I'm going to be using this phrase, child sex exploitation material. There's a few different reasons for that, and I do appreciate that the term child pornography is framed in law in some jurisdictions, and indeed is quite common parlance amongst both professionals and the media, which probably describes how the users of this material use it. But actually, I think the term is very disrespectful with respect to the enormous harm that is caused by what are in fact recordings and images of children being abused or exploited. So I'll use this phrase child sexual exploitation material consistently. If we could turn to the first slide, or next slide, please. There's three things I'm going to do today. One is that I'm going to talk quite a lot about the work that we do in the UK within Lucy Faithfull Foundation and Stop It Now. Hopefully that's not going to be too self-serving, because I want to talk about our work to give you some ideas about what practical ideas around prevention might look like. So I'm going to be talking about kind of deterrence, disruption, prevention of online sexual harm. I'm going to share some information with you about the kind of nature and scale of the problem, with a particular, I'll also talk a little bit about how issues around COVID is cross-cutting this as well. And then the second half of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about why people commit these kind of offences. What are the pathways into this kind of offending? Understanding that helps us with prevention, I think. But I think there's something deeper that we need to be in touch with here. if the figures around prevalence of online sexual harm of children are as high as many of the estimates are, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes, and if you have met with or worked with people who have committed sexual offences, one of the things that will probably strike you, and it certainly struck me over the years, is that many people who have committed these kind of offences actually seem to be quite ordinary in terms of who they are and what their backgrounds are. With those two things together, then we need some good explanations that are grounded in evidence about why people commit these kinds of offences. We need to really understand why good people do bad things. And the more we understand that, the more I think we can begin to frame really effective solutions to what I think is quite a preventable problem, the online sexual harm of children. Next slide, please. This comes from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse that is still ongoing in England and Wales. No issue is more pressing for contemporary child protection than the role of the internet in facilitating child sexual abuse. Children have been molested, been sexually abused for hundreds of years, and indeed people have been viewing sexual images of children for certainly more than 100 years. If you want an example of that, there was a raid on a photography studio in London in 1874, where a man was arrested called Henry Haler, and the police took away 130,000 indecent sexual photographs of children. 130,000, 1874. But the reality is, although this issue of the viewing of sexual images of children has been around for a long time, the internet has been an incredible game changer in all of this, because it allows what we sometimes call the AAA engine to occur. And the AAA engine is around accessibility. Suddenly these images are much more accessible than they ever were. They're more affordable than they ever were, and there's a level of anonymity that can be there in people procuring them. So people have often in the past, before the internet, gone to considerable efforts to find this kind of material and source it, and it's often been quite difficult and dangerous for them to do so. But actually the internet has been a real game changer, as has indeed the kind of the onset of smartphones, which kind of takes things to another level. Next slide, please. A few things about Lucy Faithfull Foundation. Just very quickly, we were set up in the 1990s as an organisation that worked with people who committed sexual offences, doing assessments and interventions, and back then we had a residential unit as well. But actually we've changed a lot over time, and we have, as an organisation, looked at how we take the learning and knowledge that we have and expertise in working with sex offenders or people who have committed sexual offences, and really try to apply that to thinking about how do we prevent abuse happening in the first place. And one of the key steps in all of that was the establishment of the Stop It Now UK helpline. There's an error in this slide. The helpline started in 2002. Could I go to the next slide, please? Stop It Now UK helpline started in 2002. Actually, we modelled ourselves on a helpline, which is the Stop It Now US helpline, which started in 1992. And that helpline was started by Fran Henry. You can see a photograph of her here. Fran Henry is a real hero of mine, actually. She was a survivor of sexual abuse herself. She'd been sexually abused by her own father, and then became a counsellor of adult survivors of sexual abuse. And one of the things that she started reflecting on in adulthood, she had learned that her father, who went to prison for his crimes, had been struggling with thoughts and feelings of a sexual nature about children for some time before he abused Fran. So one of the things that Fan wondered was, actually, if my dad had had the right kinds of supports, would that have made a difference? And she also wondered about whether her mum could have made a difference there as well. So when Fan started to be molested by her father, as will often happen with children, her behavior, her presentation started to change within the family. And she wondered, if my mother had known more about the impact of sexual abuse on children and what sexual abuse was, could she have asked perhaps the right kind of questions of me at that time? And on the back of that, what Fran suggested was that actually, although we do lots of things around prevention of sexual abuse in schools, and all of that's really important, making sure that children know what sexual abuse is, and if an adult makes them feel uncomfortable about something, they can go and speak to a trusted adult. But the problem with that model is that often the abuser is a trusted adult. And there's another problem here, which is actually it's not the responsibility of children to stop themselves being sexually abused. It's actually the responsibility of adults to be more protective. So she wondered whether we could make adults who present a risk of harm make safer choices, and those who are already protective, whether we could help them become more protective in a more effective way. Which is why she set up a helpline in Vermont in USA in 1992. And we took that on in 2002 in the UK. Next slide, please. The UK helpline was started off with a bit of funding from the Home Office in the UK. And if you phone the helpline now, which is open Monday to Friday every week, the first thing you will hear is one of our helpline advisors saying that you're welcome to be anonymous in this call. You're through to the Stop It Now helpline. If you give us any information which suggests that you or a child is at risk and we know who you are, then we will need to act on that. And if we know who you are and you tell us of a crime, we'll need to act on that as well. But you can choose what identity you want to take on and how you want to describe yourself. So it is giving people an anonymous and confidential space that can be used in relation to prevention. Next slide, please. And these are the number of callers that we have. I was just looking at the data that takes us to start of April this year. In April to end of March 2020 to 2021, we received just over 14,000 contacts at the Stop It Now UK helpline. Those were either callers, and the majority of them were people calling us directly, but we also have a live chat function where people can speak online live to one of our helpline members of staff. And people can also send emails to us through an anonymizer, so we never have people's email addresses, but we can kind of respond to their email. So we had just over 14,000 contacts from just over 8,000 individuals, which makes it the largest child sexual abuse prevention helpline in the world. Next slide, please. Who contacts us? You can see from this, 47% of the people who contact us are adults who are concerned about their own sexual thoughts and feelings towards children. And then about another third are people who are worried about a child in some way and want to do something that would be more protective in relation to that particular child. And then we have a number of other kind of groups that kind of contact us. Parents who are worried about sexual behavior of a child. We have some survivors who contact us who are interested in thinking through why their abuser might have acted in the way that they did. With respect to those who present a risk of harm to children themselves who contact us, we have online offenders, but we also have those that are involved with contact offending, offending within family contexts, those who abuse within organizations, those who abuse within communities. And often there's quite a lot of blurring between those categories as well. I took a call recently of an individual who said, he was a man in his 40s who said he had a teenage daughter who was 16 years old. So a teenage stepdaughter who's 16 years old, and he has started having sexual thoughts and fantasies about his 16-year-old stepdaughter, starting about kind of 6 months before. And I said to him, are you worried about sexually touching your stepdaughter or sexually interacting with her? And he said, oh no, I'm not worried about that at all. I would never do that. So I said, okay, that's interesting. So can you tell me a little bit more why you called? And he said, well, the reason I've called is I've been looking online at spy cameras, and I was thinking about putting a spy camera into the shower cubicle in the house so I could film my stepdaughter. So it's that thing about kind of recognizing that stuff around image-based offending can often start in family-based contexts. Next slide, please. And if you get through to the helpline, we don't use any volunteers. All of our helpline staff are social workers or former law enforcement colleagues or counsellors, so they're all paid staff. And it's also not a non-directive kind of counselling helpline. We're there to help people go through a process where they identify what the problem is, and we see whether there are some practical things that the individual can sign off on that might promote safety in some way. In that particular caller that I kind of mentioned earlier on, he talked about actually one of the areas that was quite difficult for him was that he often waited outside the bathroom when his daughter would be coming out from a shower. So we talked about actually a bit of safety planning and doing some different things when that happens. But then we began to look at actually what were the drivers in relation to the behavior. And indeed, this was an individual who, although still married, was looking at online pornography up to 2 hours a day, usually legal pornography. But we talked about how he, particularly because most of the material he was looking at involved teenagers, that he needed urgently to move away from that. We talked about intimacy with his wife, which had really been lacking for quite some time. We talked about his alcohol problems and how socially isolated he was. And we put together a plan about how he could begin to put together the kind of building blocks of a good life that he had really kind of lost sight of with his own kind of physical difficulties and mental health difficulties. Can we get the next slide, please? Quite a lot of the individuals who do phone us are individuals involved with online behaviour, and that's partly because of some deterrence campaign work that we've been involved with over the last 5 or 6 years. It's probably this would be probably quite a good point to play the video that I had, if that's possible. Let me show you something that kind of illustrates the deterrence campaigning work that we've been doing in the UK. See whether the video arrives. Here we go.
The Lucy Faithfull Foundation is the only UK-wide charity dedicated solely to preventing child sexual abuse. In 2015, they identified a need for a campaign which targeted online abuse at the source. A campaign to show people the damaging consequences of viewing indecent images of children and encourage anyone worried about their own online behaviour to seek help. The Lucy Faithfull Foundation conducted in-depth research with offenders to inform and shape this campaign. And from this, the Stop It Now deterrence campaign was created. Since then, the campaign has gone from strength to strength, adapting and learning with each new year. Since inception, the campaign has included 6 powerful films, which have been viewed over 20 million times.
What were you looking at?
Digital ads, which reach the right people at the right time. Hard-hitting PR, which has secured over 1,100 pieces of national and regional coverage, and extensive partner engagement with partners across media, law enforcement, and the public sector. Building on growing insight and evidence, the campaign evolves each year. Since it began, the number of calls to the Stop It Now helpline from people worried about their behaviour who haven't been arrested has more than doubled. And in 2019 to 2020 alone, visits to the website increased by 158%. The majority of online survey respondents and helpline callers who hadn't been arrested reported a change in awareness of the consequences of offending. And almost half reported they had taken action because of the campaign, including curbing their use of the internet, speaking to a professional such as a GP, and stopping viewing indecent images of children altogether. Evaluation data consistently proves that Stop It Now has an impact on reducing offending behaviour.
The advert shook me to my core, to be honest. I just saw the advert and decided I needed help.
I was suddenly aware of how stupid I was being after seeing that Google advert, and I didn't even know why I'd got to that stage.
I realised after viewing the splash page, there are ways to help myself before my feelings developed.
The Stop It Now campaign continues to reach people concerned about their online behaviour, helping to stop the problem at its source and protect more and more children. Do your part to help stop child sexual abuse. Find out how at stopitnow.org.uk/partners.
Great, thank you for that. And if you could go back to the presentation and pull up the slide that says MindGeek, that would be really helpful. The last slide I want to show you about our work before I talk more generally about online offending is, so if we could go 2 slides forward, please. There was a mention in that video of splash pages. What that is since 2015 in the UK, we've done some work with Google. Which means that if you go onto a website that has been removed from Google because illegal material involving children was on it, or if you put in certain search terms into Google, a splash page comes up saying you may be about to look at, you may be looking for illegal material involving children. Do you know about Stop It Now? We get around 200 to 300 click-throughs from those splash pages on Google every week. We also have recently done some work with MindGeek, which are the owner of Pornhub, who approached us and said, actually, we have a number of people looking for illegal material on Pornhub. Can I just kind of point out, in working with Pornhub, we've taken no money from them at any point. I think there are lots of ethical issues in relation to working with the sex industry, but this was an organization that was clearly wanting to do something here. So we've introduced some splash pages for those individuals who are looking for illegal material. I just looked at the latest data that we have for that, which is from 2 weeks ago, which is second week of May. We had 3,700 click-throughs to our online materials for people worried about their online sexual behavior from the MindGeek splash pages. So if there's one key message in all of this, it does look like if you build some structures to help people get support in relation to prevention when they're worried about their own sexual thoughts and feelings towards children, some people, not all, but some people will use that. To go on to the next slide, please. So what's sitting behind this, and if you could pull up all the bullet points, please. What we do is we bring a public health approach to child sexual abuse prevention. I'm sure many of you will be available at public health approaches. If you think about heart disease for a moment, if I have a heart attack this evening, I will go to hospital, I will get surgery, that will be tertiary prevention, the event has already taken place. But actually our medical systems would just crumble if that was the only way of dealing with heart disease. So we get universal messaging out to the public about lifestyle, about exercise, about diet. That's what we call primary prevention, the stuff that goes out universally to everyone. And if I turn up at the GP surgery because I've got high blood pressure and I'm given a statin to reduce that, then that's because I'm in an at-risk group, and that's secondary prevention. So if we take that model and think about child sexual abuse as a preventable public health issue, then a lot of what we do is about identifying and responding to concerns after they've taken place, which is tertiary prevention. But we need to go upstream and think about primary and secondary prevention. What's the messaging we get out generally to the public about child sexual abuse that people can find helpful in some way? And also those individuals that are in high-risk groups, how do we make sure that they have the access to the right resources and information to make better decisions? If we go to the next slide, please. And the next slide is a bit of work that was done by an Australian colleague, Stephen Smallbone, where he took that idea of primary, secondary, tertiary prevention and said, actually, you need to then think about how that applies to offenders, victims, families, and situations. And indeed, people who would be potential offenders and all of that as well. So you could begin to think about what a more joined up and systemic and strategic approach to any form of child sexual exploitation could look like. And we'll return to this slide at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Online sexual offending involving children means a number of different things, but it can involve viewing of child sexual exploitation material. So images of children in different ages that are sexualized in some way. It can involve online solicitation and grooming of children. Typically, that is about getting children to act in sexual ways online, with often then them being filmed in some way. But we will also see that as kind of facilitating of kind of contact offending as well. And also kind of production of indecent images of children. I've mentioned things like non-consensual sharing of images and sextortion, which are maybe kind of things that are more about kind of issues around adolescent behavior that borders on stuff around online sexual offending, but I'm not going to go into that because I don't have enough time. Next slide, please. And it's just to recognize that we have online non-contact child sexual abuse, kind of viewing of child sexual abuse material. We have offline contact child sexual abuse, but there is an overlap between these two things as well. That actually the images that are circulated online have usually involved the exploitation or abuse of a child in some way. So children have often been abused in the making of these images. So there are contact offenders that are involved with online offending, although increasingly one of the things that we're learning about is that those who are involved with the viewing of such images, although I think maybe 15 years ago assumed that the majority of them were at high risk of committing contact offences against children, increasingly the research is not backing that up actually. That's maybe something we can unpack later on in terms of kind of questions and discussion. Next slide, please. If you think about the number of individuals who are arrested in society for viewing these kind of images or involved with online solicitation, it's just the tip of the iceberg. National Crime Agency in the UK last year estimated that if you look at, in particular, kind of behaviour on the dark web, they suggested that up to 300,000 individuals in the UK present some kind of risk to children in some capacity. Actually, they just produced their new estimate today, and they've upped that figure to almost 700,000. So we need to recognise that there are actually fairly large numbers of individuals looking at this kind of material, and in some ways it's an issue that's too big for us just to arrest our way out of the problem. The biggest study that we've had looking at prevalence, and there are problems with the study, but it was a study from Germany in 2016 called the Dombert study, which looked at survey material from around 8,000 men, and asked them for a range of questions about kind of sexual behavior. Just under 2% of those individuals had viewed child sexual exploitation material. Just under 2% of that 8,000 figure. So quite significant numbers. So it's a huge problem and perhaps growing. Next slide, please. This particular publication from Europol came out in June 2020, so it's a little bit old now, but it suggested that there were quite a few signs and indicators that COVID perhaps was opening up a new time of harm and risk for children. That's partly because of the amount of unsupervised time children were now having during lockdown, but also it was about people who commit offences taking opportunities in the current environment. So they looked at the kind of increased threat assessment because of increased referrals that were taking place to NICMEC in relation to these kind of behaviours, increased referrals to hotlines internationally where people were kind of noting illegal material that they'd found online, and they also looked at dark web chatter as well that was taking place from groups of individuals who were certainly at risk of online offending if they weren't offending already. And actually, we've now seen all of that translate into crime figures. I've just said kind of here that we've certainly seen an increase in online recorded sexual crime against children in Scotland of around 20%, but that seems to be fairly kind of, I think somebody's maybe unmuted. Thank you, Tina. So that increase of around 20% seems to be part of the course. We've also seen an increase in calls to our UK helpline by about 20% since the start of lockdown. So there is certainly something going on at the moment. Next slide, please. If you want to know a little bit more about what this means in reality, then these figures come from the Internet Watch Foundation. This is where people have kind of reported illegal material to the IWF for them to kind of take down online, so illegal imagery involving children. And in terms of the kind of data they have, they also trawl the internet and indeed the darknet looking for illegal material as well. And I think there's an assumption because of kind of media coverage that we're probably talking about lots of images of very kind of young children. It's sometimes a bit more complicated than that, I think. You can see here that actually the majority of children were aged 7 to 10 or 11 to 13. The majority are girls, you can see in the sex of victims slide. Severity of abuse, not to underappreciate the seriousness here, but category A images are those images that involve penetration of a child in some way, whereas category C are kind of sexualized, kind of eroticized kind of pictures of children. Those eroticized pictures are certainly the kind of majority of the images that are being taken down by the Internet Watch Foundation. Not to say that all of that clearly does cause harm to victims in all of this, but I think we need to have an understanding of what kind of stuff it is that we're talking about here. Next slide, please. And the reason why that's important is that I think we have a drip feed from the media where we're constantly hearing about the worst, most abject offences that take place. And it's absolutely right that the media covers these most heinous of crimes, and we need to be angry about those crimes in society. But even the most dangerous of people who commit sexual offences against children had a period in their life where they had not committed a sexual offence against a child. And those individuals made choices and made decisions, and there were also contextual factors here. Next slide, please. This slide is from a bit of work that a colleague at Edinburgh University did with us, Ethel Quayle. She interviewed 50 individuals who'd been involved with group work programs that we run with individuals involved with online offending. I think one of the things that's really striking here is she tried to understand how people got into this offending. Because we often do lots of research where people fall down the line about whether they then commit further offences. But why do people commit the first offence? And usually the explanation that's given in the media and indeed in research is, oh, they're all paedophiles, aren't they? But actually what she found was that the main description provided was of individuals looking at large amounts of legal pornography, describing themselves being desensitized to that over periods of time, and them looking for more and more extreme and transgressive material, which they did find arousing, and then them beginning to collect that material, hide it away, and gather more and more of it until they were eventually arrested. In the same way that those that were involved with online solicitation of children often talked about being involved with lots of sexual activity online with adults, and sometimes in really disinhibited ways with teenagers as well, and gradually kind of shifting down to kind of younger and younger ages over time. Next slide, please. that's maybe why the stuff around Pornhub is quite important data in all of this. So it's just to say that although there's an assumption that people are kind of pedophilic who are looking at this kind of material, and many individuals are, of course, we perhaps need more richer, complex descriptions and explanations of why this happens. A study which could never happen now by John Briere in the US in the 1980s involved showing undergraduate students a range of different kinds of pornography, including pornographic material that involved young children. And what they found was that 1 in 5 of the young adult males showed some kind of sexual arousal to the images involving children. And what that might tell us is that the capacity to be sexually aroused by children in certain contexts might be much more commonplace than we consider. And we maybe need to think about how other non-sexual motivations kind of cross this here as well. I've mentioned here whether transgressive material becomes an appeal in itself. I worked with an individual recently who said that he had been looking at large amounts of online pornography that was legal for many years, and then one day was sent some images that were of 13, 14-year-old girls. And he said that he acted to that material in the way that he would looking at any other kind of material. He masturbated to it. But the following day, he wanted to go back and look at more of that material. And he said it wasn't because he was terribly attracted by the children, but actually what was going on there was that he realized that he was breaking the law when he was doing it. And that in itself made him feel a bit of an outlaw. He said his heart had never pounded as fast as it had as when he looked at that kind of imagery. So we need some kind of richer, more complex explanations. Next slide, please. The Coolidge effect we'll maybe come back to in kind of discussions. But a colleague of mine, Raj Darji, did a really interesting presentation. I realize I'm a little bit over in time, but I'll finish within the next kind of 5 minutes. A colleague of mine, Raj Darji, did a great presentation a couple of years ago. Raj is now a psychiatrist working in Melbourne, forensic psychiatrist, and he did a presentation about the things that you learn when you're in medical school about human sexuality that might be helpful when you're trying to understand sexual offending in some way. And one of the things he talked about was that actually there are a number of biological drivers that occur that are fairly well known and talked about in the literature. One of which is high levels of risk taking amongst the individuals who are involved, who are sexually aroused. We know lots about that from research into HIV and AIDS and condom use from the 1980s, that people are often involved with higher levels of risk-taking when sexually aroused. That those who are sexually aroused also have a wider range of sexual interests when aroused than in comparison to when they're not aroused. And finally, there's actually a biological process that kicks in where our sense of disgust is reduced when sexually aroused as well. And that is a biological kind of evolutionary function, which is probably because lots of things about sex can sometimes be quite icky and smelly and what have you. So we kind of shut down some things about our kind of disgust responses. You can see how all of this begins to help us understand why we're seeing enormous numbers of individuals who are drawn to and viewing these kind of materials. So next slide, please. So what do we know about prevention? I think, what I was talking about earlier on is we need to make sure that kind of adults know what online sexual abuse is, and we need to challenge some stereotypes here. The individual who comes home one day and finds that their partner has been looking at certain search terms that might suggest he's looking at illegal imagery. But then that individual doesn't ask any questions about their partner because they think, actually, but my husband's not like that. Well, actually, some people are like that. And we maybe need to go there, but in a way that isn't about othering of people who commit offences, but actually trying to understand why people do this kind of stuff and what they can do to stop doing it. So public awareness is important, deterrence messaging and disruption messaging, which we've been talking about, early help for those who are starting to offend, working with children about online safety and resilience. All those things are important. And we need to ensure that everyone knows some of the kind of practical things that they can do that can prevent sexual abuse. Just because of the time, can I jump to the slide that says going upstream? It's the one after that. Yeah, I just want to finish off with a kind of quick story, and many of you will already know the story. It's often used in kind of public health thinking, but it's the idea that of a man one day who is fishing on a riverbank, and he sees somebody floating by in the water drowning, and he pulls the person out. And then he sees another person floating by drowning, and he pulls that individual out as well. And then there are more and more people in the water, and he's feeling really exhausted. So he starts walking upstream and finding out why people are falling into the water in the first place. And then he finds that there's a rickety bridge where lots of tourists go because it's a really beautiful part of the river. And he fixes the bridge to stop people falling in. If there's one message I want to get across here, safeguarding needs to include how we identify abuse happening and how we respond to it, but it also needs to include how we proactively prevent it. And there are things that we're starting to learn that do suggest that they do work in relation to prevention. So my invitation to you is, in your safeguarding roles, is to think about how your work could move more upstream. I'll finish there. Sorry, I've overran a little bit, Tina, but that's the way it goes.
As ever, Stuart, it's absolutely fine, and thank you very much. It's been really good to hear from you again today. Some of you, well, a small number of you will know that Stuart very kindly presented with Father Hans Zollner at the safeguarding webinar last November here. It was hosted from Scotland, so it's really helpful. I think so much of your content is so pertinent to some of the problems we're encountering in terms of online abuse at the moment, and some of the anxieties and dangers that there are in relation to our children and young people. I would ask again, if anyone has any questions, if you can put them in the chat. You can put them in English or Spanish. So our South American colleagues should feel included. And if you don't have a chat facility on your computer, laptop, iPad, then Alessandra's email address is there for you to send to her. I do have two questions. I'll take the first one from Ireland. Aidan, thank you for very much for that, because I would be very interested in the answer too. Aidan is a good colleague working in safeguarding in Ireland, and he has asked if there has been, Stuart, any research into online offending in relation to clergy. And I would say not just online offending, but clergy watching inappropriate online material.
Now that's a really good question. I'm not aware of anything. There is some writing, and I can share some stuff directly with you, Brendan, looking at issues around online harm within organizational settings more generally. So not specific to stuff around the clergy, but there is some stuff that I think would be congruent with the issues perhaps within clergy. There are also some really there's some fascinating work that's been done by Nick Blagden recently, and this is going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it has been interviewing people in prison settings who have been charged with sexual offences, some of whom are clergy, ministers and priests and so forth, but asking them about the role of their faith, particularly in relation to their rehabilitation. And some of that is, I think, for me, a very interesting line about actually how do we develop kind of treatment protocols that are perhaps a little bit more respectful of people's theological perspectives, and builds on a theological perspective where people generally want to move towards a position of not harming others. So that there's some fascinating stuff that is being written about religion and sexual offending at the moment, but I'm not aware of anything specifically in the area you described, Brendan.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I've got a rather long question for you. The person hasn't been identified, but they're very grateful for the presentation. In the light of your findings around sexual arousal and perhaps the lack of disgust in particular, is it useful or productive, in your view, to understand human sexuality as fallen or as sinful? This is not a shaming sort of narrative, but a doctrinal claim about how human experience encounters distortion and brokenness from the start. In other words, in light of a doctrine or understanding of sin, why would we think human sexuality isn't fallen or broken? And if any of you are looking for a doctrinal thesis title, then I think that's a really good one to go with.
Oh, I mean, I'm not a theologian, so I don't know if I could answer that question, but I think there's something in there. I think we're all broken in various ways, and I think human sexuality is incredibly complex. So perhaps not surprising that there are these complexities, and I think there are some unpalatable truths about human sexuality that come from looking at it perhaps from a biological perspective. I didn't mention the Coolidge effect, but I'll mention it just now. And apologies if this appears flippant, because it is a bit of a joke, but the Coolidge effect is a kind of fairly noted phenomena whereby people are, particularly men, are interested in novelty in sexual things. So this is a kind of male kind of biological factor, and it comes from the term Coolidge. Coolidge effect comes from an apocryphal tale where the former American president was being shown around a chicken farm with his wife, and they're separated and they're in different bits of the farm, and the wife sees a rooster who is mating with various hens, and she asks one of the people in the farm, how often does the rooster do that? And the farm hand says, well, he does that all day. The president's wife says, when my husband comes in here, can you tell him that? So when the president arrives, the farmhand tells him this fact, and his response is, could you tell me, this rooster, does he do this with the same chicken same hen all the time, or is it lots of different hens? And of course the farmhand says, yes, lots of different hens. And of course the president says, could you tell my wife that? So that's the story behind the Coolidge effect, but it's a fairly kind of grounded, kind of biological and evolutionary kind of factor in all of this around genetic diversity. So there are some things that are, to use your language, fallen about human sexuality when we try and put it within what we would generally see as kind of monogamous, respectful kind of patterns.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for tackling that very profound question, a very interesting question as well. And our final question before we go to the break, and we do have, and I'm sorry that Stuart won't be able to answer all your questions just now, but if we can find a way of sending, if I can find a way of sending them to you, Stuart, I'm sure you will, you will generously respond as always. The final question is, what prevention measures, because I think this is very important as well, can be taken by the church to reduce the risks of online abuse amongst its members, both clergy and lay persons, and I would also add both male and female?
And I just say that that is one of the questions that we're putting to all of you when you go into your small groups. So I don't know if I want to give the answer to that. I mean, I think there are, but going and we perhaps didn't, because I had to kind of finish a bit quickly. Going back to that grid that I showed you, which had primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So universal messaging, risky situations, and where harm has already happened. And then we think of people who commit offences or at risk of committing offences, families, children, and also situations. You can see this here. Then this might give us some clues about actually, are there particular spaces here where the church could do something more proactive? And I would kind of invite you to begin to kind of think about that grid perhaps as a heuristic that might help you in trying to answer this in some way.